to have a web page.
Okay, we're good. We're rolling.
Well, you realize when you finally get to present after 20 years of reading the material, how much you're indebted to everybody that's done the tough research. Years back, as I started teaching a class on political assassinations at a small college in South Carolina, one of my students said, I know Richardson Pryor, would you like to talk to him? And of course I took her up on the offer, and it was my first, I guess, mini epiphany, realizing that Pryor, when he'd gone through the investigation, was very frustrated with the military destroying their files, wished that he had another year, and spoke about that, something different from what he was saying in print. It was years afterwards, and I realized that I needed to look closer at the CIA and the military, and that the press had blown the story for years, and it was coming out as a chapter in a number of books, but nobody had written a book about press coverage. So I thought, well, I'll be the archivist on this, and I'll try to pull it together. And I'm glad that I started on that. There are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of material. It's really an impossible task. And it's a career killer. You won't get a dissertation on it. I can attest to that. You'll infuriate academe that largely has rejected it within political science. It also has so many aspects to it that you can never be very complete. But the material covered today clearly could be the lead story in every paper in America, as it has been at every COPA conference that I've been at and the ASK conferences. The material begs for somebody to get out to the mainstream press. But we're stuck with a conundrum. Why is it with this great information that they don't cover it? We could say, as John has, this is the corporate Wurlitzer, but it's more nuanced than that, because all of these outlets actually have a chance to break the story, and they're not here, they're not breaking part of it. So we're set to explaining this further. As students ask you, you realize how inept the simpler answers are. So I'll try to fill in a few of the gaps, make a few comments, but I think it's perhaps most noteworthy to mention Joseph Goebbels as he talked about the goal of a mass media. The goal is what you want in a media system: ostensible diversity that conceals actual conformity. And I think that's what we've got, but it's difficult to clarify in a short discussion, because it is a complicated case, and reporters that want to do good work on this are overwhelmed by the information. It is so sophisticated at this point that you have to have covered things for a while, although they could be spoon-fed certain portions of the story. I think the most interesting remark that I've heard recently was Jefferson Morley, a reporter for the Washington Post, at a conference back in 2004 in Washington. He said, and I quote, "This is a messy, complex, slippery subject with nothing analogous in journalism. To take on the task of saying something new and definitive at this late date is to sell the story today. The bar is very high. The political implications are huge. People don't like to talk about this consideration in the newsroom. Credibility is on the line. To say there was a conspiracy in an assassination of President Kennedy would be a remarkably bold political statement. The story is old, but the CIA budget is upwards of $20 billion a year. The political implications are very alive. This affects the weighing of fact and belief. Solutions to the assassination will be more political. The best proof is Oliver Stone's controversial hit movie, which was not factual, but it was politics that changed the situation, the declassification of 6 million pages, not journalism. So what I'll do is move back to show some of the ties to create the Cold War cooperation between the press and government, and then I'll drift to some reflections on the case in general. Much as I'm tempted to go through historically, which is the way I set up my manuscript, that would take a while, And frankly, I'm not as eloquent as William Turner, who was able to boil down all that information into a 20 or 30-minute essay, which really is what this calls for. Few Americans had the political background in 1963 to analyze the assassination of President Kennedy and its implications. And not many scholars or journalists accused the CIA of overthrowing foreign governments, manipulating foreign elections, unions, church movements. Few realized the extensive CIA role in psychological warfare, assassination teams, alliances with the media, cooperation with corporations, the autonomous nature of the CIA's foreign and domestic policies, the extensive co-opting of American academics, or the scale and scope of the CIA's domestic operations. Only recently have we learned of Operation Northwoods, approved by the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, which proposed launching a secret and bloody war of terrorism against America, supposedly originating in Cuba, in order to develop public support for a war they intended to launch against Cuba. Let me... As I started to look back, the period of muckraking ended in its more effective sense by 1919, when the progressive journals were purchased by a corporate America. So these voices were effective, but they were essentially bought up. Upton Sinclair gets into this in greater length. And you can see there's an academic debate as to whether the public should get access to the information as to what's going on with government, or whether it should be hidden from them. And this could be seen a little bit with American correspondents reporting on World War I. They were far more successful in covering and publishing than their French or British counterparts until America entered the war. American foreign correspondents were then given officer rank, housed with officers, had their access to battlefields restricted, were required to swear an oath to convey the truth and refrain from any writing that would aid the enemy. Their stories had to pass through military censors. If you will, it was the beginning of the embedding strategy or the management of news. It's pretty easy to trace this throughout history, and to just give a very rough outline. During World War I, mass media leaders coordinated and supervised numerous psychological warfare operations with government agencies through the U.S. Committee on Public Information, directed by George Creel. To its practitioners, it was a necessary progressive management of public opinion, as Walter Lippmann famously noted in The Manufacture of Consent. The U.S. government utilized some of the new strategies in the Red Scares of the 1920s. A competing journalistic notion of public information as necessary to strengthen democracy was advocated by John Dewey, but it failed to resonate as widely as Lippmann's ideas. Fast forward to World War II, literally the same debate. Office of War Information, then headed by the famous journalist Elmer Davis, thought that America would be best served by the truth, but another school of thought instituted at the Office of Strategic Services believed that lying would maintain morale and better win the war. 1940, President Roosevelt sent his trusted friend, corporate lawyer Bill Donovan, to assess the war in Europe. Donovan proposed the creation of the OSS to gather intelligence as well as to create propaganda to counter the insidious Nazi strategy of psychological attacks on the moral and spirited defenses of a nation. The majority of Donovan's assets at the OSS were journalists. Psychological warfare included propaganda, sabotage, guerrilla activities, bribing, blackmail, assassination. During World War II, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower told a meeting of newspaper editors, quote, "Public opinion wins wars. I've always considered as quasi-staff officers, correspondents accredited to my headquarters." When CBS President Bill Paley began working at the Office of War Information, along with C.D. Jackson, an executive at Time Life, he was given the rank of colonel. Paley's first major assignment was to establish a radio network in Italy through Armed Forces Radio to, quote, "lure Italian listeners with entertainment programs interspersed with propaganda," just the sort of arrangement CBS had used for its South American network. Paley's value was enhanced by his ability to work with both black and white propaganda, black being lies. After World War II ended, the OSS offices of propaganda, covert action, psychological operations were combined into the Office of Policy Coordination and the State Department, while the Office of War Information was dissolved. So we get a sense of this Cold War cooperation. Most of Congress didn't know, even with Radio Free Europe, the nature of the funding and who was on staff with it. Numerous media experts, including C.D. Jackson, Eugene Lyons of Reader's Digest, sat on this board. By the mid-1960s, Frank Stanton, corporate president of CBS, was the chairman of the executive committee of Radio Free Europe. By 1950, the CIA had set up an operation called Mockingbird, conceived of by Frank Wisner, covert operations directed by the CIA. His assistant was Richard Helms, and Phil Graham, publisher and part owner of the Washington Post. The program was to formalize the recruitment of journalists, and each journalist had a code name, a field supervisor, and a field office. By 1951, the CIA had set up a number of generally highbrow magazines in Europe, a number of countries, and they were actually social democratic. They realized they wanted to appeal to moderate socialists, so it wasn't a notion of just conservative outreach. A fellow named Wilford has recently written more extensively on this, a launching of the American Newspaper Guild. Some of you have been through this material, so I'll take liberties and edit it. Some new material that came out in Wilford's book. Some OSS members, Philip Horton and Douglas Carter, served on the magazine staff and maintained their intelligence contacts with Allen Dulles and James Angleton. Carter, an expert in psychological warfare, helped found the National Students Association for the CIA and would later serve as a special assistant to President Johnson. Of note, I think, way back to the Korean War, the censorship heavily impacted reporters. UPI reporter Robert Miller noted, "We're not giving them true facts, the public true facts on Korea. We haven't been for the last 16 months, and there'll be a little improvement in the war coverage unless radical changes are made with military censorship. There are certain facts and stories from Korea that editors and publishers have printed, which are pure fabrications. You don't know that when you print them, though, because many of us who sent the stories did not know they were false." General Douglas MacArthur responded to critical reports of the war by expelling reporters or pressuring news organizations to recall correspondents who offended him. The top brass of CBS killed a report by Edward R. Murrow challenging the military's assessment of the war. Bill Paley warned correspondents to be careful of what they said during these difficult times. and I think foreshadowing some of the coverage that we're getting now out of Iraq. In 1953, James Aronson said correspondents assigned to the UN command were not permitted to speak with UN negotiators. They were briefed several hours after each session. They were refused permission to inspect documents presented at the discussions that were dependent entirely on U.S. Armed Forces public relations officers. And it goes on. I think an interesting summation of the period in '53 came from New York Times Chief of Staff John Swinton at a toast before the New York Press Club in 1953 regarding the independence of the press. Said, "There is no such thing at this date in history as an independent press. You know it, and I know it. There is not one of you who would dare to write your honest opinions, and if you did, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. Any of you would be so foolish as to write honest opinions would be out on the streets looking for another job." By 1954, CIA Special Study Group on Covert Actions, the Doolittle Commission, recommended expanding the role and methods of psychological warfare. It is now clear that we're facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means or whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the United States is to survive, long-withstanding American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop espionage and counter-espionage services and must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by cleverer, more sophisticated, more effective methods than the ones used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. Well, we didn't find out about this for a long, long time. At its peak, 1967, CIA Communications had an empire embracing 800 news and public information organizations and individuals known as Wisner's Wurlitzer. At a conference that I held at my college back in 1991, I had a chance to talk with Locke Johnson, who worked with the Church Committee as one of its top researchers. He's a professor at the University of Georgia. Church Committee determined there were 400 to 600 reporters that worked with the CIA on a regular basis. So I asked them, is that your sense on it? And was it closer to 400 and 600? He said at least 600. That's the best source that I have on that. So it was more extensive and than some of us might have imagined. Now, a lot of these ties were social ties. There is a sociological work from a critical perspective that some of you know, The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills, Who Rules America by G. William Domhoff. He's updated that. And he looks at these social ties to see how the elites are tied into banks and corporations, but also government and with the mass media. It ends up a lot of these guys, as you've heard, have gone to school together and socialized together. And you can trace this through for almost all of the major media outlets, and those where the ties are the closest ultimately end up doing more favorable reporting to the Warren Commission and the single bullet theory and Oswald as the lone nut. So there's your kind of foreshadowing, if you will, among others. Let's me pick on the Graham family, but I could pick on a lot of them. And other people have done the heavy lifting, so I merely paraphrase. They were the owners of the Washington Post and Newsweek, and they would hold weekly salons, and they'd invite all sorts of power players. So, for example, a typical list of Invites in 1960 included CIA asset Joseph Alsop, cousin of FDR, also former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Allen Dulles, Desmond Fitzgerald, Tracy Barnes, who was Alsop's lifelong friend, Richard Bissell, diplomats Chip Bowen, David Boos, Justice Felix Frankfurter, reporter Arthur Kroc, Walter Lippmann, Cy Schultzberger, and even at time the Kennedys. Joe's brother Stuart, his journalistic partner for years, had been in the OSS, was an old friend of Allen Dulles and Frank Wisner. These links go on and on. They give you just a few more from a slightly different take on this. New York Times editor Harrison Salisbury, his comment was, these leaders out of the press and government were Yale and Harvard and Princeton, lawyers, bankers, businessmen, journalists. They were General Alder, Allen Dulles, Ben Wells, Walter Sullivan, James Angleton, John Oakes, his brother, Kim Roosevelt, CIA men who pulled off the Mossadegh coup, Pope Brewer, Kenneth Love, James Reston, Walter Carroll, Richard Helms, with whom he worked in pre-war UPI days, Wallace Carroll. They were all correspondents, wined and dined and flattered by Dulles and Wisner and Des Fitzgerald and Tracy Barnes and Reston, and he goes on with it. So you see those links. That's nothing surprising, but it really is extensive, and I think it does set the framework for us to look at this. Merely in the interest of time, let me jump to some overall reflections. Truman, as you know, tried to respond a month after the assassination with a powerful letter pointing fingers. And ultimately, by 1971, Truman said, "Political truth can be the biggest, damnedest lie ever. But if motivated toward a pragmatic political goal, preferably for reasons of national interest, and stated with total belief and fervor, it becomes true." And I think we've seen some of that. I think the notion early on was, as given by the State Department to a number of news sources, go easy on the Oswald communist angle. And the early reporting ultimately did conform with the major government sources. As Bill Moyer said, the press back then was trusting of government, and they were literally like lobsters in a trap. They listened to these sources. They were expected to follow those sources. There wasn't a lot of encouragement for independent thinking. And I think that that was part of the cultural milieu, along with the McCarthy era that tended to scare a lot of the independent press, like The Nation magazine and The New Republic. They'd been called on the stand, been seen as unpatriotic. So there was caution there. Peter Noyes actually wrote in his 1969 book, and I forget the name of it, that he had talked to a number of people at CBS, and they were given calls by the State Department to go easy on the Oswald communist angle. So there was that pressure that they had to contend with. Much as I'm tempted to try to walk you through the way I did, step by step, with what happened, frankly, I don't have a good overview of it that will do justice to it in 25 minutes. So let me try to launch to overall reflections. After the assassination, Cold War cooperation commingled with selected disinformation, memories of McCarthyism, concerted Justice Department and FBI efforts to convince the public that Oswald was the lone assassin. The complexity of the case the collective trauma, the caution regarding national security, political naivete, and disinformation from some government agencies and elements of the press confounded the mainstream media for quite a while. The mass media meekly acquiesced to their exclusion from the Warren Commission and provided vigilant support for the Warren Report even prior to the release of the hearings and evidence on which it was based. Though some intrepid reporters raised questions regarding the Warren Report, the mass media chose not to explore most of these leads. After a few years, an uncoordinated citizens' inquest, along with a handful of alternative and mass media outlets, had poked enough holes in the Warren Report that much of the mass media grudgingly responded. CBS, NBC, Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, the Saturday Evening Post, Life, AP, and UPI, bolstered by CIA briefings, remained largely resistant to the rising chorus of critics. I want to note that AP and UPI, the major news services at the time, put out books that essentially paralleled the Warren Report. These were the leading news services. A lot of information was out there. They could have respectfully disagreed at the end or raised a couple pages of questions. They did not choose to. AP even released their report in 1967, and it was merely a reprint of what they printed in 1964. So we did have these major news agencies, and I'd love to find some media scholar that could give me more history on the AP and UPI, because they were thoroughly folded into the power structure at that point. By the time of the Garrison investigation, government agencies protected their bureaucratic backsides rather than pursue the truth. The CIA and FBI then generated a psychological war to protect themselves and bolster the waning legitimacy of government amid widespread race riots and war protests. The platonic noble lie to initially protect national security had morphed with some of the mass media into the big lie, Goebbels' notion that the great masses of people will more easily fall victims of a great lie than a small one. The media vitality of Watergate was short-lived, and coverage of the assassination remained limited and erratic even after the House Select Committee was formed. Although their report concluded that President Kennedy was probably assassinated due to a conspiracy, most of the mass media denigrated the conclusions and ignored the new leads. The sphere of legitimate controversy had been briefly widened, but the gatekeepers seemingly resisted the questioning of political legitimacy as threatening national security. The alternative media apparently wanted to devote energy to movement building. They didn't cover the House Select Committee hearings very well either. So the case actually had drifted away in the mass media. There were sporadic stories, but not all that many until Oliver Stone's revival of JFK. And as you know, it was savagely critiqued even before the movie came out. Nonetheless, the movie served great purpose to reinvigorate conferences. All of us remember when there were 600-700 people coming to conferences back then. The law was changed, the Assassination Record and Review Board, to declassify 6 million pages of documents. So to some more general comments about American journalism, a loosely organized profession, unequipped to report on anatomy, radiology, ballistics, forensic evidence, trajectories, the codes of journalistic ethics remain unclear. Most journalists reject licensing procedures, are indifferent to professional associations. It's a press system that's been adrift for a long time within an increasingly concentrated ownership in the mass media. Ben Bogdikian puts it at 5 major mass media organizations that have about 140 different ties to each other. So it's not as if they compete, they cooperate in many areas. So it's hard to break through the standard analysis from More Marxian sociologists would be look at ownership and its needs, then look at advertising, the major moneymaker, and its needs. Those are filters for the truth. But a lot of that's internalized by the major reporters that want their own shows or the best beats and don't want to tell stories about sources for fear they'd be pulled off the source and wouldn't be given subsequent information. The symbiotic relationship. Ted Koppel, Nightline, I think, at the top we could take what he has to say on this and you'll see how he's internalized it. This is an interview with Christina Borgeson. No, I don't just take their government word for it, but when they tell me why they're going to war, I certainly have to give proper deference to. If the president says I'm going to war for reasons A, B, and C, I can't very well stand there and say the president is not telling you the truth. The actual reason that he's going to war is some reason he's not mentioned. I, as a reporter, have to say, here's what the president's saying. Here's what the Secretary of Defense is saying. Here's what the director of the CIA is saying. And indeed, when everyone at this point who has access to the classified information is more or less with one voice agreeing that yes, there appears to be evidence that Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, but certainly chemical and biological weapons, are you suggesting that the entire American press corps then say, well, horse manure? He wasn't going to take them on. Listen to Dan Rather, who after leaving CBS now is saying a few things in a BBC Newsnight interview. He said there was a time in South Africa when people would put flaming tires around people's necks if they dissented. And in some ways, the fear is that you'll be necklaced here. You will have a flaming tire of lack of patriotism put around your neck. Now, it's that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions. Fear of loss of respect, job assignment, job security, friends, and status. And all this was heightened after 9/11. So I'm not suggesting that he goes so far as to come clean with his own past. And we're all aware of how Rather reported things for CBS and their illustrated version of the Warren Report, which came out the day the report was released, or the study done in 1967 that's been much written about with the CIA cooperating with CBS, and they didn't ask the tough questions and rather disagreed but ultimately capitulated to the pressure from the higher-ups at CBS, and the same type of pressure in 1976 when the four-part series came out then that CBS did. But at least he's saying a few things that I think are the insider talking. Let me suggest a few other things. I think a model of a prisoner's dilemma is in effect, where the prisoner thinks there's more to be gained by mutual silence and defensiveness than pursuit of the truth. So none of them raise the issue within the mass media. There's a scholar named Elizabeth Noel Newman in her book, The Spiral of Silence, explored the notion of silence as reflecting the profound power of social control if you want acceptance within the ruling elite, of which the mass media are a part, that weighs heavily on pursuing questions of systemic legitimacy. And I think that's the key thing, because in order to look legitimate, there has to be a number of investigative reports, but they stop short of questioning the system's legitimacy. Recall Jefferson Morley's comment, where the editors declare, we hate this story, it's messy, it's inconclusive, and to say anything new, we won't go first because of the extremely large political implications. Morley goes on, he talks about another piece that he tried to get printed where, in essence, to get stuff out, he's willing to take half a loaf. And to have the piece printed, but without much context. So we will get information, but without the context that people new to the case or people that have just read a few books, they won't have enough information to make a lot of sense of the new information. He had a story on CIA officer John Whitten. Some of you may know the article, The Good Spy, for Washington Monthly. And he says, and I quote, "Talking with the editor, good editor, about the last line, Whitten was interested in pursuing the investigation of Oswald's Cuba-related activities. I noted that his thinking along this line paralleled Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Robert Kennedy, and Fidel Castro. Editor replied, no, I believe you, I just want to cut the line. So Morley says, it's true. The editor responded, but this line about an interesting man at an interesting time tips the piece into being a conspiracy piece. Morley noted, well, the line is true, and you think it's persuasive, so we have to take it out because it's true and persuasive. So I took it out because I wanted the piece published. I quote Morley because I think among the mainstream reporters, and I could be wrong, please, I'm looking for input on this, that he has done the most the last 5 or 6 years and is a good source at looking at some of the filters and difficulties of getting the stuff into the mainstream media. I think Peter Dale Scott may be right in his conjecture about two factions maneuvering to manipulate the media to impact foreign policy. One faction, including CIA counterintelligence and the Deputy Director of Plans, as well as military intelligence, sought to highlight Oswald's communist connections to push for another Cuban invasion. He calls that Phase 1. A much larger faction in government, including the FBI, President Johnson, the State Department, and Congress, wanted to downplay Oswald's alleged Cuban and Soviet connections, ostensibly to diminish pressure for a response that they thought could turn nuclear. Let me take liberties of skipping over a few things in the interest of time. Got a lot on what Garrison had to endure. How legitimate would the government and mass media appear if 45 years later it was proven that a coordinated effort to cover up the assassination had occurred? And they think of this. There is, again, systemic legitimacy for the media organizations to admit they were inept or compromised. The Associated Press now has about 242 bureaus, reports in 121 countries, reaches 1 billion people daily. The AP Board of Directors consists of 22 newspapers, including a lot of them that already have institutional history on this issue, including the Washington Post, McClatchy, Cox Newspapers, ABC, a number of smaller chains. 2 directors are members of the Hoover Institute and the Business Roundtable. 3 are on the board of Mutual Insurance, and 1 is on the board of defense contractor Lockheed Martin. Again, a weaving in to the military-industrial complex, which we've seen in the past. It doesn't get as much research time because it's cumbersome to get to that point. C. Wright Mills did it. G. William Domhoff has done it. I think it's a fruitful area for further research. We see the money lust as seen by the Columbia Review of Journalism. Pressure for profit, perverting journalism, cutting the number of reporters, increasing infotainment. They call it a journalistic malpractice. Academe, let me go after where I'm currently ensconced, can sometimes move material from the periphery to the mainstream, yet assassination research remains marginalized in political science and history. Rigorous research threatens a paradigm shift to accepting that a coup d'etat occurred. Academe would be obliged to admit that they have confused rather than clarified, that American political legitimacy has been lost, that officialdom and mainstream media have acted as unwitting accomplices. Ironically, based on numerous polls, the less formally educated public more effectively sorted through the Warren Report and its coverage. To some extent, academic groupthink paralleled that in the mass media. The notion that their life work had confused epiphenomena with reality and weakened democracy is painful to confront. Philosopher Thomas Kuhn observed that careers, reputations, access to resources, anxiety, and self-deception preclude paradigmatic change, particularly when there's no middle ground existing for reformist views. They either stick to their old views or admit they were wrong, and we're not seeing much change yet, even though the case is ripe for re-examination now. Future scholars may compare the U.S. assassinations of the 60s with the era of assassinations in Japan and Germany in the 30s. The investigation of these assassinations are cases of the U.S. genre of show trials on the assassination. And as many of you know, it isn't just the assassination of President Kennedy. We've seen aborted and synthesized investigations in a number of areas, whether it's the assassination of Martin Luther King, Senator Kennedy, Malcolm X, Watergate, Iran-Contra, BCCI, the October surprise, the invasion of Panama, the 2000 election recount, the 9/11 Commission, the rush to war in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. They have to admit that a number of these investigations are wrong. And they faltered on all of these challenges. I think we're also facing an aspect in the public dealing with a loss of power and something that's hideous to ponder. And I think it's difficult for the public to ponder things like, let's say, a flood in New Orleans, so we put off all the funding until after the crisis. It's perhaps the conscious and unconscious public denial of threatening news regarding everything from global warming to foreign policy contributes to the lack of coverage. The U.S. public has despaired over, but largely denied the implications of many of these investigations. Although the vast majority of the public believes there was a conspiracy and a cover-up, they don't, many of them, know it. To move from belief to knowledge is to move from irresponsibility to responsibility, which is quite threatening. I think that's an aspect of what we're facing. We've talked about the lack of access to information, and let me skip over that. Again, to Jefferson Morley with his information on George Joannides as a CIA liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Some interesting work, but appearing in sources that aren't even the standard alternative media of The Nation or The New Republic or Mother Jones or The Progressive or Z. They're not covering it. And let me jump to that because I think that's useful. Z sees things more in a structuralist sense, that there aren't splits in a ruling class. For The Nation, Chomsky has written from a structuralist perspective, and so has Coburn. And Max Holland has said essentially that Garrison's a KGB dupe, and that's the position of the Nation. The New Republic was very critical of the Warren Report until there was a change of leadership at the New Republic, and a former CIA operative took over in 1970. And then you can see actually 68, excuse me, so that the reporting at that point is critical of Garrison, and the New Republic doesn't do very much, even though they've done a really good job for alternative media, not as good as Ramparts or the Midlothian Mirror, but they were at least covering it. Mother Jones is not elected to do much on this. I.F. Stone. A number of people tried to get I.F. Stone interested, and he wouldn't cover it. Irwin Noel of the Progressive. People tried to get him interested, and he chose not to go that route. So we have our more, if you will, established alternative press for a number of different reasons, not wrestling with this issue. And it's interesting to note that when Ramparts did take it on and do some good investigative reporting, that their readership climbed rapidly, and they were more popular and more read than The Nation and the New Republic combined. So one could even make money off of this and be a very viable source for other muckraking if they were to undertake this. I think the interest is still there. I mean, I can tell you, even in the backwoods of South Carolina, when I talk to men's clubs, they're interested. People want to hear this. They want to know who has power and how it can be changed. So the interest isn't dead, although it is more distant. Forgive me for going on so long with this. Jim Hoogan, interesting source here, tried to pitch it to CBS Mike Wallace. Does anyone remember the story? Yeah. Very briefly, Mike seemed interested, convinced by it, and thought the story was something we should pursue. First, it had to go through Phil Scheffler, senior editor at 60 Minutes. I'd worked with him in the past. Fine journalist, fine editor. He's not much inclined to do any stories with a conspiracy angle. This had come up in the past. He said, "Hoogan, do you have any conspiracy theories that we've not adequately reported?" I said, "The Kennedy assassination." It's funny you should bring this up, because I probably know more about the Kennedy assassination than anyone at CBS. Hoogan said, "I was astonished." He said he was involved with the early efforts of CBS looking over the Zapruder film, said it was so obvious that at least 2 people were firing in Dealey Plaza that day. Said, "Oh, did I miss something? Was that reported?" He said that you have to understand that just because 2 people were firing in Dealey Plaza doesn't mean it was a conspiracy. You know, we've heard that line. New York Times, I think, floated it first. I didn't know that to say. Said, well, that's true, but it's still kind of newsworthy, and I don't recall it coming out. In the end, what did happen is Mike got back to me and said, we're not going with this. Essentially, there were 3 objections. One was that the science at the heart of Don Thomas's work on the police dictabelt, I said that wouldn't be a problem. CBS routinely dramatizes science stories. Mike agreed, but he was concerned that the story might have an ambiguous result. And I said, that's possible, but we know that there's a 96% certainty that the results will be less ambiguous. He said, well, that's true. And then he said, but in the end, we have a bigger problem. Everyone knows that the Warren Commission got it wrong. Everyone knows that it's a conspiracy. That's Phil's point. It's not news. There's such a heavy investment in the story by people in the past. Mike Wallace said there is one piece that this story, there's one way, rather, this story could get on the air. If, let's say, Senator Howard Baker would front the piece, we'd do it. What it meant was that 60 Minutes have only their own credibility and to sell, basically, and if they get a story like this wrong, they're completely destroyed. But if someone such as Howard Baker were to pitch the story, then we could report, without fear of contradiction, that Howard Baker said A, B, and C, and we didn't get it wrong. So that's what they were waiting for on it. Alternative media, like all organizations, fall prey to an iron law of oligarchy. those in the hierarchy make decisions, keep information from others, and they've not decided to cover these events in a while. Let me, John, how are we doing on time? We have a little bit more, or should we?
A little bit.
Okay. Former AP and Newsweek reporter Robert Perry, who broke the Iran-Contra story in 1985, only to see the mass media back off of it for a while, observed, "It's as if the final price for winning the Cold War is our confinement to a permanent childhood, where reassuring fantasies and endless diversions protect us from the hard truth of our own recent history." Racing fast forward, the Downing Street memo that many of you know about, when it finally was circulated on the web, and it was after the war had started, about the origin of, essentially, that Tony Blair's aides were skeptical they could convince the British public to go to war, but Sir Richard Dearlove, chief of M16 intelligence unit, assured them that the Bush administration was busy, quote, fixing the intelligence and the facts in order to develop the rationale for war. Although European journalists ran with the story in spring 2005, the American mass media ignored it until Americans learned of it from the internet and pressured them. It was then dismissed as old news. Between May and June of 2005, ABC did 120 segments on Michael Jackson, 42 on Natalie Holloway, none on the Downing Street memo, and the other mainstream media largely followed suit on it. Watergate reporter Carl Bernstein has lamented that the media has abdicated our responsibility, and the consequence of our abdication is the spectacle and triumph of an idiot culture. We know with the current book out by James Douglas, a terrific read, no coverage in the news on that. It could be a lead story by itself, just interviewing him. I actually, by coincidence, had known a theologian that knew Douglas from his theological work. He's very well respected in the theological community. So he writes with great fervor, great clarity on foreign policy. It's a worthy piece. Dan Ellsberg liked it. No mass media coverage on that. It's out there. They certainly have those possibilities. Again, let me close with a few more quotes. One back to John Swinton at the New York Press Club in 1953, with observations quoted by Upton Sinclair, of observations quoted by Upton Sinclair. "The business of a journalist is to destroy the truth, to be outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of Mammon, to sell the country for his daily bread. We're the tools and vassals of the rich men behind the scenes. We're the jumping jacks, they pull the strings, we dance. We're the intellectual prostitutes. Empires do reap what they sow." I, with my students, try to bring things back to traditional notions and say from the Declaration of Independence, it called on us to pledge our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor to form our nation. The same commitment is needed to reform the nation. Thomas Jefferson declared, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves, and if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." John Kennedy's admonition for Eastern Europe through Voice of America, 1962, "We seek a free flow of information for a nation that's afraid to let its people judge truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that's afraid of its people. So I'm starting with that outline. Thank you for being so patient, and I appreciate your feedback.
You consider Harrison Salisbury a CIA asset? The reason I asked you this is he wrote a review of David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, in which he said he predicted. Do you think Harrison Salisbury is a CIA asset? The reason I ask you this is he reviewed Best Evidence by David Lifton. He said nothing about the book. He did say that at the time at the time of the assassination, he thought there would be a lot of, conspiracy theories. What he neglected to say was that he said that in the Bantam edition to the Warren Report.
See, this is where I need to go back and look up that material.
I have it.
This is terrific. That's what I was hoping for on it. The Times typically was very clear on who they would assign to do books, and they weren't allowing much in that was critical. If you go through book reviews in the New York Times of critical books, they gloss over much of the information that would lead the public to be more critical. As to whether he's an asset, I think it's fair to say it wouldn't surprise me, and it could well be, but he might have infused the cultural norms within the Times that made Peter Keyes, who was one of the investigative journalists that was writing critical pieces, Peter quit because he wasn't getting support at the Times, and Harrison Salisbury, that started an investigation for the Times and was pulled off it to do other things regarding what was going on with Vietnam. That might have been the case. It's a very interesting piece of the puzzle with Times coverage, but it would fit into a larger mosaic of the Times ignoring good books or glossing over information in good books. I'd love to see that, to add it.
And you know about how they handled the Martin Luther King case where a civil jury declared that there was a conspiracy?
Right, and there was essentially an article saying that they wished the King family hadn't have been duped into the process, and that nothing of import essentially came out. I'm paraphrasing on that.
They put it on the straight coverage, but they put it on page 11. A civil court finding a conspiracy?
Yeah, and the people who worked on that case were very clear about inviting all of the press down to Memphis because they wanted this to be a case study in power and for people to better understand what was going on. And largely the coverage on the best of the new chapters on the King assassination was glossed over by the New York Times and almost all of the mainstream media as well, which is just as resistant in covering that as covering this case or covering the case of President Kennedy. And our conferences in Memphis in 1998 and 2003, I think, are evidence of that as well, or Lyndon Barston with his presentation at this conference, all of which should be page one news. And we're not given that. So it's a fascinating case study that you bring up.
I did get interviewed by the AP today on the Knoll. That was a first.
That's great news.
And there was a lot of press up there when I spoke. The press came out for this first, what they took from it or what they'll show, I don't know.
Yeah, I was checking with a friend to see if they're showing anything. I don't know.
They'll probably show that stupid protest up there on the top. Well, I arranged for a shuttle to take people who want to go to the Texas Theater at 6:30 from the lobby downstairs. Bob Groden has yet to present. I'm back to get his laptop and has some amazing new photographic stuff. So I don't know exactly when he'll get back here, but we'll sort of wait, I guess, till we get a fuller house to do that and to do the movies. People can go to this thing and come back from it.
Like 10 o'clock for me?
Well, I guess it'll be between 9 and 10. I don't know.
Yeah, JFK's about 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Yeah, so JFK will go till 9:30. We'll probably figure around 10 to do Bob. If there's enough people here at 9, we'll show a movie or something.
Is Rex here going to present something? Are you going to present something? Good.
Any arrangements?
So she was in a position to know quite a bit about the assassination. And I think she was then moved to inside Robert Kennedy's, circles and the other Ted and everybody else, into the Kennedy family as a penetrator for that fact. Well, yes, but I mean, she was also the last person to see the Robert Kennedy police file before they locked it up after he was shot. So she had ties to the whole family, but she was working with Ted Kennedy, and she was invited to that cottage, but she was part of a number of traveling political secretaries that were used by different campaigns and camps called the Boiler Room Girls. Judy Woodruff, yes, she's the one that I mean, that said she heard this shot upward and to the right, but Leslie Stahl also, there were 6 or 7 of them, and they all got great careers with the media, or they got top corporate positions in these law firms after Chappaquiddick. And I believe that she was responsible for setting Ted Kennedy up, but she thought they were going to kill Kennedy. But actually, in the day is, I believe, creep in the Nixon, because people on the island told me that there were Nixon people crawling all over the island. Tony Lazowitz said that he got $10 million from Chuck Colson that summer to do Operation Sandwich, but they never asked him what it is. I think it's wedging the Oldsmobile in the sand. He said he was supposed to go up 3 days before Ted Kennedy got up there and pose as a journalist and ask him embarrassing questions. Well, embarrassing questions about what? 3 days before. And he never did pose the journalist. He's not present at any of the press conferences, but he's up there operating, And if you remember, Lazowitz, the bagman for Watergate, was also the cop that they had look into Oswald's background in New York for the early investigation.
He only had $100,000 then.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't have such big bags, but Mary Jo Kopechne knew a lot, about different things, and she was an insider, but I think knew about the assassinations, but I don't think she realized that they couldn't kill Ted because it was like one more Kennedy would have blown the whole thing sky high, but they had to get him out of the race. So she, I think, slipped him a Mickey, got him out into the car. She drove, they said, not him, that he was drunk. Her purse is in the back of the car, which is kind of strange. I mean, and then I think the deputy Look, who had no reason to lie as a sheriff's deputy, saw the car sitting at the edge of Poochie Pond at midnight. It was long after they left the party. Ted Kennedy wakes up at 4 a.m. in dry clothes and comes out and asks what time it is from the hotel people and goes back to sleep. I talked to people who saw him in the morning in a jovial mood. You're reading the newspaper and in the morning having breakfast, nothing's wrong.
I heard that.
And so I think he doesn't even know what happens. He's just taken out of the loop.
Yep.
Mary Jo is murdered. And Mae Brussel, as I said, saw these people moving and understood the dynamic, and she said they're going to call the parents and said they're going to kill your daughter 3 days before. And the parents wanted to reinter the body once the blouse results came back, which was after they buried her. The coroner just looked at her briefly and said that there was nothing. He didn't say. He said he thought it was not drowning but asphyxiation. She was upside down. She had her feet over the back of the seat, her rear end in the seat, and her head in the footwell. So like being sitting upside down in a car seat, but that's because the footwell was the elevated part of the car where there was any air. So she had climbed to get air, but eventually the oxygen ran out in the CO and she asphyxiated herself.
She might have been alive in the car.
Yeah, I think she was alive for a period. But when the blouse came back, it had blood all the way from the neck, down the back of the blouse, and down both arms. So somebody had stabbed her or something. And then I think the car is just driven in, pushed off and driven into the drink. But Kennedy could not have been the driver of the car, could not have gotten out of the car. Physically, the car was, that door was smashed up, and it's hard enough to get out of a car underwater. Couldn't have done the swimming.
I thought there was evidence indicating that she was dead before she hit the water, before she...
I don't know, but I mean, I think that she wouldn't have been able to get up to where the air well was, the footwell was for air without being alive.
So someone actually steered or pointed the car towards water, or was she actually hit by the side and knocked off?
No, I think they just steered it in.
Steered it in, and
she was unconscious in the thing.
She was semi-conscious.
Yeah, and just drove it into the water, and then.
So you think they met her at some point, or stopped her at some point? And then...
Yeah, I think they met her, took Kennedy out of the car, but then killed her. and dumped her into the drink, and then tried to blame Kennedy. But I think Holcomb Heston and Robert Cutler worked on it, and their thesis was that they came to him with blackmail letters from her, signed by her, and said, do you want a manslaughter rap or you want a murder rap? And so they backed him into a corner where he took a manslaughter rap because they could have proven motive. Even though I don't think he was in the car. Why he didn't think he could prove he wasn't in the car, I don't know, but maybe he just was drunk and couldn't remember where he was, so thought maybe they could prove it against him or set him up somehow.
So that dirty allegation that she was pregnant and carrying his child is total garbage.
That's the right wing.
So they were probably targeting her. We're going to kill her anyway, she knows too much. Let's use her and...
Or just that
get
she's
Teddy.
convenient because she's,
Yeah, they can kill two birds with one stone.
I don't know if they had other motives for killing.
I don't think they would have told her they're gonna kill him, even if that was part of their plan. They would tell
Well,
him, maybe we're gonna beat
knock
him
him
up or
out,
something,
who
something
knows?
lesser.
I mean,
Yeah.
what they told
Yeah, she
her,
didn't
but
know.
I
Obviously,
think
she didn't know. She was
the evidence to me is that he was slipped a Mickey, and
Yeah.
the judge doesn't believe the Kennedy family version of them diving for her, knowing that she was down there and not doing anything.
Well, you know, he didn't swim at 2 o'clock in the morning.
No, I mean, and he didn't have the back to make that kind of a swim, and it's strong current at night, and there's sharks, and it just isn't a plausible story. But neither is him calling Markham and those guys and having them dive, so the judge didn't buy it.
What do you think his cousin's involved in this? Was it?
Is that Markham? Is that the
Yeah,
cousin?
right.
Gargan and
Gargan, yeah. I just think that he said, you guys gotta go along with the story, for me and cover, but I don't, and it was also significant to me that John, JFK Jr. went down in that plane on the anniversary night of Chappaquiddick, all those years later. It was the same night, and I thought that was a signal or, planned. And he was gonna take a commercial flight to the wedding, and he got a death threat, and that's why he chose to take the private plane, and I think they had set that up to push him into the plane and sabotage the plane.
Where did you find out about the death threat?
It was in the news that he had gotten a death threat and changed his plans, one of the stories about it early on.
Death threat if he got on an airliner?
Yeah, well, he just was getting on an airliner and they gave him a death threat. I don't think it was specific, but he said, well, then I won't take the public plane, I'll take my private plane, and, but I think that's what they wanted him to do.
I know a lot of the researchers are saying there was a qualified flight instructor in the right seat.
There could have been. I mean,
they did
there's
do it.
conflicting stories about it, but he often flew with the flight, but he was a good pilot himself.
Yeah.
But they didn't apparently recover everybody. I mean, they didn't know for sure if they recovered.
Well, didn't they blog off the search for 18 hours?
Yeah.
So they could have
Way
done
long.
anything down there on the plane or
Right.
remove a body or.
Other time to do something or just current moves
Yeah.
bodies, and wreck.
But they found them in their seat, well, supposedly they found them with their seatbelts on, in their seats.
What Hankey said they found was that the fuel line had been shut off somehow. And I don't, he thought that could only be manual, but I do know that they have some capability to interfere with the electronics on planes, and so I think that they can bring a plane down. Chuck Colson, said that Mrs. Hunt, E. Howard Hunt's wife, was delivering money to the Cubans in Chicago when they shot her plane down.
Yeah, they shot it down.
That's what he said.
Wasn't
And
a
that
bomb.
plane was supposed to be just a commercial airline crash, pilot error. That was Chuck Colson in the Watergate testimony, and they don't go on and ask him anything about it.
Yeah.
I mean, and taking money to the Cubans, I mean, that's interesting too, because their story was just taking the mob, but it said to the Cubans. It can be synonymous, but, what Cubans, and, what were they trying to cover up, and, but she was a bag woman. She was higher in the intelligence agencies than E. Howard Hunt was. That was another sort of marriage of convenience.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And
I thought, I had heard she was a bag man for E. Howard Hunt. She was taking money.
she was paying payoff money through
Yeah.
Hunt, to cover up, to get people not to tell the truth
Yeah.
about some aspect of Watergate, if that's what it was, or JFK, who knows, but, yeah, but she was in the plane, and she was being interviewed by this woman, Michelle, I'm not remembering her last name, African-American woman, exclusive interview on that flight. And her body was, Fred Friendly from CBS ordered her body cremated before even calling the family. And her body was cremated, and so the evidence couldn't be had. But on some of the bodies, there was arsenic poisoning. And I guess arsenic comes off of the seats burning, but this was too many levels In other words, the teeter level it was at, you would have been dead and not breathing anymore to get up to that teeter level. In other words, if you get to a teeter level of 2, you're already dead, and this was like 4. So it could have been fed to them or injected into them on the plane, but it wasn't from the seats burning. And the pilot and one of the co-pilots, and there were other important people on that plane. There were people involved with some scandals around the ranch, the King Ranch, and Leslie King, that is the birth name of Gerald Ford, and he was an adopted guy, so he had ties to the people that died on the plane.
Gerald Ford's real name was
Leslie King, yes.
What was the tie-in with Leslie Stahl and the other female reporter?
They were other women in the Boiler Room Girls group with Mary Jo that were at the cabin at the party that night.
And they got
And
promotions.
afterwards, they went way up at the top of the media, or the top of these law firms and things, I think is hush money.
Sure.
You know, give them don't ever talk about Chappaquiddick.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, there are a number of factors, but, and the shooting of Wallace, I think, was connected too, because I think that this was Nixon getting rid of his political enemies
Yes.
in that election sequence. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think the full story of Mary Jo's ever, you know, really been told, and
Mm-hmm.
more to it.
Yeah, I always wondered why he took that course of action where he would admit to something that he didn't do.
Well, that's the best explanation I've seen,
Yeah.
is that they could have got him on a murder charge, and he didn't have enough evidence to exonerate himself entirely, I guess. And
So the premise was blackmail, that they could prove, even if it wasn't true, that he was getting blackmail letters from her.
like they had signed blackmail letters from her that they had, maybe he'd never seen them
Yeah,
up to that point. But it establishes motive
yes.
for murder, and then if he doesn't have enough, he doesn't have a good alibi, he doesn't, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you could frame him. And so they just said, take the manslaughter rap, so he did.
Yeah.
But they knew that that would kill him politically.
Apparently, the Mary Jo's parents were satisfied with his private explanation, because they didn't raise much fuss, did they?
Well, but they wanted to reinter the body when they
Sure.
found out about the blouse. And
Yeah.
a lawyer came in named Blatchford
Yeah.
and convinced them, offered to help them, and convinced them that they shouldn't reinter. Blatchford had been the lawyer that penetrated the Peace Corps for the CIA. And, you know, and during the Kennedy administration. And so when a lawyer shows up to help you, show them the door.
Yeah.
Because I've seen that over and over, these lawyers
That's
come.
true. James O'Reilly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
When they show up to help,
Yeah.
it's like when the police surround your house to protect you, get the hell out of the house.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that's the end of the game.
But it looked like, I'm not sure, but it looked like they did not blame Ted for their daughter's death.
Hold on one second. Hello? Yes. Hey, what's the word? What's your timing? All right, well, if you can't find me, just call me on this cell. I'm just going to the restaurant downstairs, so.
We're not political.
What time is he gonna show up?
Oh, okay.
Jim Morrison.
That's fine.
I didn't know his father was a Muslim
All right.
at Big Admiral.
Birthday too, you remember?
Yeah, that's
Give him a
right.
cake.
That's right. So you give an ETA?
Yeah.
Does he have an estimated time of arrival tonight?
I told him to come a little before 10 so he could set up the computer. We'll do it at 10.
Yeah. Who was the other girl besides Leslie Stahl?
Judy Woodruff is one. There's 2 or 3 others. They're not coming to the top of my head.
That's okay.
Doris Kearns Goodwin isn't part of the group, is she?
No, okay, sorry.
No, she would
No,
not.
these were young, you know, pretty
Yeah.
political secretaries.
Woodruff is on, the one's on PBS now.
Yes.
She's at,
Yeah.
why'd she take the job?
And she is the one
at
that
PBS?
I mistakenly said was Stahl. It was Woodruff that was at the Hinckley shooting and said the shot came from above and to
Yeah,
the
she
right.
made that mistake, so they banished her to PBS.
Well, she didn't make it again, she put her biography, and then, you know, I did work on the woman journalist that died, Golden Girl, they wrote the story about her, and she was in the news in Philadelphia.
Jessica Savage?
Yes, Jessica Savage.
The one that supposedly backed up into the water?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
well,
looked for those two.
went down into the, you know, into this canal. Now, this is a historic canal. The
Yeah.
river normally has absolutely no water in it.
Yeah.
And while there had been some accidents in it, because it didn't have a guard fence,
Yeah.
they were very rare because the area where she went down is next to a parking lot. for this restaurant that sits at the main intersection there in the little town, New Hope. And New Hope was starting to become a retreat for people that lived in New York, like to go down to New Hope for the weekend. Another person that lived there was Abby Hoffman. And so it was Chez Louise, I think. It was a restaurant there that was pretty popular, and she had gotten involved that summer. She wanted to get the news spot that Nancy Chang eventually took, the Ganker spot. So she was on cocaine, but I know this because her cocaine dealer was also a cocaine dealer for another friend of mine. And so she heard from the cocaine dealer this, but she was doing cocaine. Yeah, Connie Chung, that's what I mean, yes, Connie Chung. Anyway, what was that, NBC? It was whatever one she was bucking for, but she wanted that position. So she got off the cocaine, and she cleaned herself up, and then that summer she was doing Frontline. And they had this thing on Frontline where you could order the transcript when it was done. So I was catching them. I don't watch very much TV, but I was catching them, and I saw something that she was going to do one, and it was on the death of this guy, Bloomington or Bloomingdale, that was the head of the NFL, and it was called The Secret History of the NFL, and it was about this guy that was head of the NFL, and he was challenging a mob thing that was around point shaving for betting wins, and there was this mob thing to corrupt the NFL scores, and he was challenging it and trying to get the mob out of it and stop it. And then he was a good swimmer, but he went swimming at the beach and he supposedly drowned. And the family didn't believe it, and they would raise these questions. So that was one. Then the next one she did that summer, it was after that I got the transcript and I started watching her. The next one was called God's Banker. And it was the story of
P2.
the propaganda due and the death of the guy that's hung under Roberto Calvi is found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge.
Yeah, it's in the movie Godfather 3, actually.
She did a story.
And she did independent investigation on it, and she went there and she identified the people that he was last seen with before he was found hanging on the bridge the next morning. And these guys that came to the hotel and took him out of the hotel, and he had $18,000 in his pocket when he was found hanging, and they said it was a suicide, and he was involved with the Vatican Bank scandal and Licio Gelli and propaganda due. But the two people that took him out of there were connected to Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. And Haig, had a connection with the P2 guy, and but none of that had come out. And Francesco Pazienza, I think the guy's name was tied to NATO and tied to P2, and also tight with Haig and Kissinger. And it was his goons that came and took him. And so that was like, these guys had never been named or charged or anything in the news or the connection to the kids. So, and I was getting these transcripts by that point, and I was calling Mae Brussel and sending them to her. I said, Mae, you can't believe it. I said, this woman is doing your stuff on, on national news. Then the last show that she did was, there was that one, there was God's Banker, and there was, the Rat Line. And it was about how they took Klaus Barbie and the Nazis out of Germany at the end of the war through the 919th Central Intelligence Corps, which included in its membership Henry Kissinger, Theodore Ted Shackley, the blonde ghost who was part of Bay of Pigs, and J.D. Salinger. Yes, which is why I think they're reading Catcher in the Rye at the shootings. It's a little message that this boy's one of ours. And Salinger's very reclusive and everything, but he was part of the 919th Counterintelligence Corps that moved these Nazis and covered up on them. And this was the first thing that had been on TV about the Rat Line. And I was just like, oh my God. And then the next week I called and I said, Mae, you're not going to believe this. She said, what? I said, Jessica Savage is dead. And I had gotten the news that afternoon on the radio that she supposedly went into this canal and drowned. Well, the reason she was going down there was they were actually looking for a house down there because she got off the cocaine, straightened herself out, started doing investigative reporting, and all of a sudden this guy shows up as a boyfriend, Murray Fishbein. He's the hatchet man for Rupert Murdoch. And he's the guy that got the Village Voice from Murdoch. He's the guy that got the Boston Globe from Murdoch. And Murray Fishbein. And
He's dead in the car, still with his safety belt on, okay, and upside down in the water and drowned. She's in the back seat. And the dog is in the back seat, and the dog tried to get out of the car and scratched, but there's no signs that he or she tried to get out of the car. Okay. So I drove right down to New Hope. Well, the first thing I did was I called 3 places. I called the newspaper editor, I called the coroner's office, and I called the police department. Okay? And what I found out was that the car wasn't discovered till like 12:30 at night. But a woman who, and the other thing about why they went in, there were some earlier accidents, but the only guy that died in the accident was so drunk that he didn't know where he was, and he went down the canal on a day. He slipped the front car, the car slipped in, and he went underwater. But you'd have to have a long, heavy rain, and they had one that day that Jessica went in, and so there was water in there, but normally there wasn't. So he went into water. He was so drunk he didn't know where he was, and he drowned. Other people just like their tire slipped over or something like that, and there was some talk about putting a guardrail up. But normally, you go into the parking lot of that restaurant, and you get there by crossing over the canal on a little bridge that goes out to the main highway. There's 2 intersecting routes there, and it's right at an intersection. So Jessica and Murray had been to this restaurant several times, I found out when I went down there. So they knew how you went in and how you went out. To get to where they went down the canal, they had to drive past 2 signs that said trespassing, no entry, and some bushes on a little gravel driveway that goes back behind some houses that are there, and it's just their personal driveway. So nobody drives out that way. There's no reason to drive out that way, And then the car is found with the wing sticking up, but it's basically completely turned over and upside down, and they draw it back out. And they had a picture of the car. It's a station wagon, and it's got a V down the roof from the front to the back. Well, when you go into that water, you're going slow anyway, but the only thing you're going to hit is flat mud at the bottom of the canal. I mean, there's nothing there to make a V in the car. So that didn't look right to me, but the newspaper guy had called some of the neighbors, and one of the neighbors had heard a big crash around 10 o'clock. Okay. And so he thought that's when the car went in. And then I called the coroner's office. I didn't get the coroner, I got the aide, but she told me about the dog scratching, with Jessica in the back seat, and then just some early details. And then I called the police department, and I can't remember what they told me, but one other thing that just didn't sit with me. I think they told me about dragging the car out and having the V in it. And so I drove down there, and I interviewed the waitresses that served them, and they hadn't had anything to drink. And they left the restaurant in this pouring rain at 7 p.m. Well, why would you go out with the dog, and you're done eating dinner and you haven't been drinking at 7 p.m. and 3 hours later drive down a gravel driveway going the wrong way and go into the water? I think that they left, they went back to the apartment, they were ambushed to the apartment, they were killed there, they were put back in the car, or at least knocked unconscious. The car was driven back and it was tipped over, and that's when it goes to the edge of the canal, tipping over, that's what makes the V, and then it slides down in, and then later they're found dead in the car. And this same coroner that rules that, it was just, an accident on their part, it was the one that did Abby Hoffman. And Abby Hoffman's son called me, America, and said that he was wanting to get a good autopsy because he didn't know what happened to his dad. And he said that he saw his father, because he was supposed to have overdosed on barbiturates and alcohol. And one thing he said was, my dad was a communicator. Even if he was going to kill himself, he said he's the kind of guy that would have wrapped himself in a flag and jumped up to the top of the Empire State Building and left some kind of a message. He said, and made a message out of his death.